So let's go through the mind map on Sunningdale. And again, remember, you're going to have your documents. You go in, have a bash at answering those documents to the best of your ability, but have your, be able to write your paragraph on the subject. So if Sunningdale comes up, know your facts, get them all down on paper. You pick up marks at both higher level and ordinary level. Okay, so there, I think if you knew what was on this mind map, you'd be sucking diesel in terms of the Sunningdale Agreement. So what was it? It was the first attempt at power sharing in Northern Ireland, and it happened between 1973 and 1974. Why was there a need for power sharing? Because of the Troubles, which had started in 1969 as a protest against what Catholics believed to be the sectarian government of the state of Northern Ireland. The important personalities involved in the Sunningdale Agreement: British Prime Minister Edward Heath, the leader of the Ulster Unionists, Brian Falconer, the SDLP leader, that's essentially the Catholic leader, Jerry Fitt, and then the kind of radical anti-compromise loyalist leader, Dr. Ian Paisley, who a lot of people would say played a major role in the failure of the Sunningdale Agreement to bring peace to Northern Ireland. In the early 1970s, Northern Ireland was a basket case. You had, a campaign of violence by the IRA. You had a responding campaign of violence by organisations like the UVF, sectarian attacks on the police, attacks on the army, and this agreement was an attempt to stop nationalist support for violence and to draw support away from the IRA towards, peaceful democratic means of change. The Sunningdale Agreement introduced a new system of elections in Northern Ireland. So instead of having first past the post, which basically meant that the person with the most votes gets the seat, and anybody who didn't win gets nothing, they introduced this idea of proportional representation, that every part of the community would be represented proportionally based on their vote. So if 60% of the electorate were Protestants or Unionists, then they get 60% of the seats in the Parliament. But if 40% of the voting population were Catholics, well, then they're going to get 40% of the seats in the Parliament. So they get some representation, some voice. Prior to that, you could have 60-40 in the breakup of the electorate, but you could have a 90-10 makeup of the Parliament. So important concept to understand, proportional representation. So it also meant that the Sunningdale Agreement also stated that Catholics were guaranteed seats in the government, which they were not. From the foundation of the state of Northern Ireland, with the Government of Ireland Act of 1920, Catholics had no representation in the government of the state. So Sunningdale said, no. Not only will you have seats in the Parliament, but you'll also have a seat at the big table where decisions are made, which was good. And there was an agreement that gerrymandering, which was essentially, don't overcomplicate it was essentially fixing the boundaries of constituencies so that you could influence the results of elections in your favour. So, in other words, where you had an area where there were lots of Catholics, those Catholics, that constituency would be placed with a larger Protestant population in an artificial constituency to ensure that Protestants won. So that was seen as unfair, sectarian, unjust. One of the things that Catholics said was wrong. So at Sunningdale, it was agreed that would end. In March 1973, William Whitelaw, who was the Northern Ireland Secretary of State, representing the British government, he produced this white paper, this proposal for an agreement. And they proposed that Northern Ireland would have its own parliament, an assembly, that the assembly would have a power-sharing executive, so both representatives of the Protestant and the Catholic, or the Unionist and the Nationalist communities in the Parliament, and crucially, that there would be a Council of Ireland which would look at issues related to governance of Northern Ireland, and that the government of the southern state of the Republic of Ireland would have representatives on that Council of Ireland. Now that became the big no. When Ian Paisley said Ulster said no, that was the thing that he was most zoning in on, that there was no way that they were going to agree to any say in the government of Northern Ireland from the Dublin government. So why were Unionists opposed to power sharing? Number one, there was this sense that we had founded this state, that this was our state. James Craig was supposed to have said, in fact I don't think in reality he did say it, that Northern Ireland was going to be a Protestant state for a Protestant people. But this idea was that this is our place. We don't have to share it with you. You have your own state down there, 26 counties. Off you go down there. There was also the argument that by changing the way Northern Ireland was governed, or by introducing power sharing, that you were surrendering to terrorism. That the IRA had to, launch this campaign of bombing, of shootings, of terror, and that by agreeing to share power, you were bowing to terrorism, and that was not acceptable. But the big block was this Council of Ireland, because the Unionists saw it as a kind of a backdoor potential betrayal for the unification of Ireland, a step towards a united Ireland. And that was something that was absolutely not going to be ever acceptable, and that, as part of the agreement, was the sticking point. So, June 1973, there are elections for the new Northern Ireland Parliament. Unionists win their majority, 50 seats, Nationalists win 19, and a power sharing executive was established. But Unionists still said, no, well, that's all okay, but this Council of Ireland, we object to it. So no government was formed because of that. So despite the fact there was an election, despite the fact there was an agreement of, the government, there was no actual government because of this problem with the Council of Ireland. So the Prime Minister called a meeting at a place in England called Sunningdale in December 1973, and an agreement was signed in Sunningdale by Brian Faulkner as the leader of the Ulster Unionists on the 9th of December 1973 to share power, the Sunningdale Agreement. And that was greeted with outrage by many members of the Unionists' political elite or community in Northern Ireland. The DUP, the Democratic Unionist Party, led by Ian Paisley, called it a betrayal. The Ulster Vanguard, this group of young Unionists, members of the Ulster Unionist Party, who were utterly opposed to power sharing, led by a man called David Trimble. They weren't even invited to Sunningdale, so they felt that this was a deal they could not accept. Faulkner was immediately condemned as a traitor by Unionists. The Ulster Workers Council, which was the governing body of the Ulster Unionist Party, voted to reject the Council of Ireland on the 4th of January 1974. Faulkner was forced to resign as head of the Unionist Party, but remained head of the executive, which is the government. So you had this weird thing that this guy, who was meant to be the leader of his party, was no longer the leader of his party, but remained the head of government. Now, that can't happen, right? That's impossible. How is he meant to govern when the party he's leading don't support him, and in fact he's no longer the leader of that party? He's not democratically valid then. So that meant that the agreement was never, ever going to survive. But they tried. The first meeting of the new assembly, this power sharing assembly, met on the 22nd of January 1974. Not long before I was born, and the world changed for the better, lads, right? And the Unionists, the DUP and the Vanguard members went into the meeting place, and they wrecked it and threw chairs around the place and disrupted the meeting. They would never accept it. And then, of course, there was this period of months of torture where the British government persisted, and the Assembly and the Executive persisted, but just in the teeth of absolute, complete Unionist opposition, it wasn't possible. And the breaking point was on the 15th of May 1974, when the U.W.C, the Ulster Workers Council, called a general strike. And that strike essentially shut the state of Northern Ireland down as long as the Sunningdale Agreement was in place. It was supported by loyalist paramilitaries from the UVF and the UFF. Ports were closed, power stations didn't work, buses, trains, airports, the transport infrastructure was shut down. It was impossible to do business. Northern Ireland was rendered ungovernable. The British government had to accept reality, closed the executive. That was the end of Sunningdale. That was the end of power sharing, believe it or not, for the next 30 years. So, and in those 30 years, many thousands of people died in the conflict between Unionists and Nationalists, Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland. So there you go, that's a little bit of revision. I don't think any of you will watch it, but sure, hopefully you will.